Right, it is noon. It is my pleasure to welcome all of our insiders today. I'm super excited about this presentation, by the way, because I'm a World's Fair nut. As you know, for those of you who may have joined the Flushing Meadows Remnants tour a couple weeks ago, we've got a bunch of World's Fair stuff coming up as well, but super excited about Jade Dosko and her work documenting remnants of World's Fairs from across the world and history. So not just New York centric, we're going all over. And I got a sneak peek at some of Jade's images, and they're amazing. Now, as most of you insiders know, we like to do a little bit of a roll call. Where's everybody coming from? We're already seeing in the group chat, we've got Westlake Village, California, good old Brooklyn coming at you from Windsor Terrace, Brooklyn myself, Hellertown, PA, Aurora, Colorado, Pete Tannen, you're always first from San Francisco. Glad to have you here. Peekskill, Upper West Side. So everybody's flooding in from all over. It is 12:01, and I know Jade has a very robust presentation. So I'm going to let her start a couple things. You can keep letting us know where you're coming from. Princeton, the Bowery. I love it. And as always, any questions that you have for Jade during the presentation, please put in the group chat. I will be monitoring it. We will do Q&A when Jade is done. So Jade, it's all you. I can't wait. Go for it.
Great. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this special virtual artist talk with Untapped Cities. I see a lot of familiar faces, so great to see you all here. Today, I'm going to be sharing a project I've been working on since 2007, photographing the remaining architecture, art, and landscaping of international World's Fairs. And especially in these dark times, it's nice to think about the things that we can create that are born of inspiration and innovation, where people come together to create these things and leave a lasting mark on our planet together. So I'm going to get started and share my screen with you all. Okay, thought we'd start with good old New York, since that is where I'm based and where a lot of my work originated in this series. And just a little bit about myself, I'm a architectural and landscape photographer. I'm very interested in environments that kind of provide a dystopian, utopian element. So the World's Fair project certainly contains those elements. And then I'm working on another large body of work that's very New York based, photographing the Fresh Kills landfill as it transitions into a park. So another idea where it's kind of this dystopia that is turning into something really beautiful. So I'm gonna get started. So since the 1851 Great Exposition of London, World's Fairs were grand, temporary, elaborate fairs where the middle-class public would travel in order to witness the latest innovations in industry, technology, design, and the arts, as well as experience exotic cultural displays, meaning presentations of non-white culture. The 19th century fairs were directly tied to the innovations of the industrial age, mass production, and speed. World's Fairs, later known as expos, continue to take place every 2 to 4 years, but they're almost exclusively now in Asia and Europe, because America decided we were too triumphant to bother taking part, to take place and they still celebrate technology and architecture and things like that, but the relevance and the cost of these events has been questioned in recent times. On another level, World's Fairs and expos have directly affected both the urban planning and infrastructure of the cities which have hosted them. Cities have long used these events to create mass transit, housing, hotels, public art, landscaping, public parks, and grand monuments. Since 2007, I've been photographing what is left behind after the fairs close, and how this architecture that was constructed for this very specific temporary purpose has survived into the unforeseen present day. And while many of the fair sites have been beautifully preserved, such as in Paris and San Diego, many more fairs did not have the budget or planning to intentionally preserve fair structures, landscaping, or public art in a way that made sense in an unknown future world. And of course, you could say that about any architecture, but for World's Fairs, they're really this crystallization of that specific era, and the world, meaning the world after the fair closed. As a result, the remnants of these events often are quite arbitrary. A blue robot sculpture here, an old fair restroom there. I like to think of old World's Fair sites as time capsules of urban planning and past ideals through design. So I thought I'd quickly just talk about where the project idea originated. I was in graduate school at the School of Visual Arts in 2007. And at that time, I'd spent several years photographing the architecture in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where I was living, often these grand old warehouses that had outlived their original architectural purpose. So I was really thinking about structure and the built environment and kind of how it transforms over time in a way that's unpredictable. I happened to be with family in Seville, Spain, and we were on one of the typical kind of tourist buses. And it took us from the old city across this very futuristic bridge designed by Santiago Calatrava to the acres and acres that were left over from the 1992 World's Fair site. And this is what was before us. This is from that site, which I shot later in 2007. Acres and acres of overgrown, very odd looking pavilion buildings. Some were in use, some weren't. And immediately it struck me as quite unusual that this kind of unkempt site would be something that the tourist authorities would be excited to bring us to. So when I got back to New York, I started to really research World's Fairs in person. And mind you, I had no real direct experience with them. I wasn't born in time to catch the 1964 fair. And my experience was just kind of passing the New York State Pavilion on the highway on the way out to Long Island sometimes, and I really didn't know what it was. As I started the project, and now I'm going to start showing you sites in a chronological order, meaning when the fair took place, not when I photographed it. I became very interested in mapping out where the original fair structures once stood. And I should add, I'm a lover of maps, I always have been. And this provided kind of an interior view of how that original design was implemented on the urban site and what was left. So when I go to each site to photograph, I bring these old maps with me and I compare them against a Google map, and I kind of try to trace out in physical space where the structures would be or were moved to. I'm going to start with 1876 in Philadelphia, the Centennial Exposition. And again, part of the fascination for me in this series is the arbitrary results after the fairs closed. And in the case of Philadelphia, some of the few buildings left were Victorian fair toilet buildings. And when I photographed these, they were abandoned, as you can see. Then I traveled, or I didn't travel, but after that, New Orleans hosted a fair in 1884 and used the event of the fair to transform kind of wilderness into the beautiful and verdant Audubon Park, which we can see here. Not many structures left from the 1884 exposition, but this was left. This is from the Alabama iron ore display. And of course, heavy industry was a major point of pride in some of these 19th century American fairs. So if you can imagine, there's this beautiful park and then this very strange chunk of iron ore in the middle of a golf course. By the way, don't take a large format camera onto a golf course. It's pretty scary. Of course, Paris is probably the fair that has created the most well-known monument on the planet. The Eiffel Tower was specifically constructed for the 1889 Universal Exposition. And at the time, people found the tower vulgar and atrocious. But of course, it's the most well-known icon on the planet. And here we have tourists, of course, lining up to see the tower. And the French sites had a lot of vision as to how to integrate these fair buildings into the future city. There's a lot more vision than I have found in, for example, North American sites, which are a real hodgepodge. So in the 30s, the two structures on either side were constructed for the 1937 exposition. The most famous of the American expositions, most likely, was the Columbian Exposition in Chicago of 1893. And if anybody's read the book, or if you haven't read the book, The Devil in the White City, wow, it's such a fantastic nonfiction account of the drama that went into constructing this thing. And in 1893, Chicago wasn't really on the map as a major urban force, such as New York. And so this fair was really important to kind of say, we're not just a bunch of Midwestern country farmers, we're a real city too. And they brought in, the top designers and architects. The firm of McKinley and White constructed much of the White City as it was known. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the landscape. So all these huge characters in design came in to design this incredible World's Fair site. However, before they could decide if they wanted to make these buildings permanent, an arsonist set fire to some of the largest structures. And at this point in time, the only real building that's left is this building down at the end, the Beaux Arts Palace of Fine Arts originally, now a Museum of Science within the park. And on the left-hand side, kind of leading up to the structure, we see the remnants of Frederick Law Olmsted's landscaping. This would have been a Japanese design-inspired garden and kind of lagoon, and now we can see it's quite overgrown. Also, when I was visiting Chicago for this first shoot, I had the pleasure of meeting with one of the curators at the Art Institute and looking at the original photographs, documenting the fair as it took place. And, thinking about that and having read the book and thinking about the idea that all of these structures were lost to arson, I really wanted to create an image that was more enigmatic of a presence of nothingness. So this picture is where I retraced in physical space where the largest fair buildings once stood, the Manufacturer Liberal Arts Building. And I decided to just try a really long exposure at night where the building once stood. So this was a 30-minute exposure. I had no idea what I would find on my film afterward. And it ended up being this very abstract kind of lyrical picture that I feel does convey this kind of sense of grandeur and mysticism and something missing. Moving into Europe, in 1897, there was an exposition in Brussels. And another aspect of photographic and architecture that I find greatly appealing is how buildings are repurposed over time. So this originally would have been a panorama building. In Victorian Europe, panoramas were all the rage. So big paintings that would literally wrap around in a cylindrical building. This has been transformed into the Grand Mosque of Brussels. And so I kind of love that transformation from a panoramic building into a mosque, which makes perfect sense as they have very similar architectural forms. Brussels also was under the helm of King Leopold, who's one of the most racist, colonializing kings of Belgium. And so there are a number of rather disturbing monuments to this time left in the park. I'm going to go past this one. And then moving back into the United States, also in 1897, Nashville, Tennessee decided to construct an Acropolis. So whereas in Greece, you can only see ruins, you can see the full thing in Nashville. And this was initially supposed to be temporary as well, but the citizens of 19th century Nashville rallied to make this building permanent. I'm going to move on a bit. 1904 or 1901 in Buffalo held the Pan Am Exposition. This is called Mirror Lake, and this is the historical society behind it at night. And another kind of conceptual approach, I traced out where the Japanese village once stood, which is now simply a suburban cul-de-sac in Buffalo. In 1904 in St. Louis, the largest aviary of the time was constructed. It's now part of the St. Louis Zoo. And the zoo is really quite wonderful as it is filled with these kind of naturalistic plantings. And so photographing there was quite fun because it kind of felt like I was discovering this remnant through these wild plantings. 1933 in Chicago was the Century of Progress International Exposition, and this would be the first time that much of the public was exposed to modern architecture inspired by Le Corbusier. Not much is left there except for this lagoon, which I photographed in the middle of winter, which I thought was befitting for Chicago. And this column, which was a gift by General Balbo under fascist Italy of the 1930s. So another kind of anomaly stuck in the middle of this park. And moving on to the World Wars, we have the 1935 exposition in Brussels, where we see this extremely fascist kind of architecture starting to become more popular on the fair sites. Oh, I just realized I went out of order. My apologies. Okay, we're going to go back to 1915 to San Francisco to the Palace of Fine Arts and to San Diego. This was the prize-winning Moreton Bay fig tree, which is still there and quite massive. Now we'll go back to the 30s. Also in the 30s was the 1937 exposition in Paris. This is where Guernica was first debuted. This is where Debussy first heard Japanese music, which inspired his composing. So this was a really important fair on many cultural levels, and on many historic levels, seeing as this was one of the last fairs in Europe before the World War. So then we have the 1939 expositions. There was one in San Francisco and one in New York City. And again, these were to be the very last fairs before World War II. I kind of love these old maps because the advertising and the colors are so specific to that period, as well as the font. So here we have the map of the Golden Gate International Exposition. And what's fascinating is immediately after the fair closed, which was built upon Treasure Island, which was constructed, it was a human-made island constructed to have the fair exist, was immediately turned over to the Navy for military command pertaining to the World War. Right now, there's still these grand exposition buildings left over from the 30s on Treasure Island. And I really found the sculptural attributes that are left quite fascinating. It's this very physical, muscular style of that time. And so now these structures are used for film and TV studios. And another of the buildings left over on Treasure Island. And a rear facade view also on Treasure Island. And then, of course, in New York, we have the Queens Museum, which was constructed specifically for the 1939 fair and was the New York State Pavilion at that time, and is a fantastic museum today. So World War II happens and the world shuts down. So years pass, and in 1958, the next World Fair takes place in Brussels, where this incredible structure is designed. It's called the Atomium, and it celebrates the beginning of the atomic age. So, you know, a strange thing to think of, but that is why this was created. I loved the Atomium so much and traveled back a year later to photograph it at night in its nightclub attire, if you will. And then we move into some of the greatest mid-century fairs. These are really, by and large, my favorite to photograph because this is where the designers really started to push themselves. Up until the early 20th century, as you may have seen in these photographs, much of the buildings were very much neoclassical in design and a more of a traditional approach. Starting with the Atomium, people started to get a little more wild, a little more fantastical in the ambition for the World's Fair structures. So Seattle is a great example because, of course, we have the Space Needle, and it is the defining feature of Seattle, and again, designed explicitly for the World's Fair. Also in Seattle, there's the Universal Fountain, another really appealing sculptural aspect that's left. And World's Fairs also were situations where there was an attempt to describe what everybody would be doing in the future. And in the 60s, there was this anticipation that in the future, we would all be only using monorails for transportation. So all of the 60s expositions featured monorails as the main source of transportation. Here in Seattle, we see the monorail, which is still just on the fair site. I don't believe it goes all over the city. And now it bisects Frank Gehry's kind of oddly designed Museum of Rock, where each segment of the museum is a different color pertaining to Fender guitar design. And this is one of my personal favorites from the Seattle shoots. This is the Seattle Science Center Arches at Night. And it's really, I think, captures kind of the beauty and wonder that could be created through design in this period of fairs. Another aspect of this structure that I really love is, if anyone sees that building on the bottom right, you may recognize that facade. This is where Minoru Yamasaki designed the prototype for the facade of the World Trade Centers. And being among the many New Yorkers who literally watched the towers fall in person, I kind of think of this photograph as a memento mori to that day and to those buildings. So then back to New York, don't worry, we were gonna get there. So the 1964 New York World's Fair, not without its problems. And you know, World's Fairs are problematic in many ways. They're optimistic in many ways. And the 64 fair kind of crystallized several of those, you know, those kind of polarizing aspects of these events. Robert Moses decided we have to have a World's Fair, much as in because he was so impressed by the 1939 fair when he was younger. And even though Seattle had just held a fair in 1962, he was very adamant that New York should host one. I should add, there's a governing organization called the BIE, or the Bureau of International Expositions, which is based in Paris. And they did not approve a 1964 fair because one had just been held in United States. But Moses, being Moses, forged ahead and decided that this would happen. And kind of similarly to the 1939 fair, there's a lot of focus on capitalism and consumerism. There's a lot of products for the kitchen, and also an emphasis on driving, because this, of course, is the golden age of the American highway culture. So there are GM pavilions and a Ford pavilion, IBM pavilion, as computers start to become more prominent. So there's you know, just like all of the earlier fairs, it really was a reflection of what was going on culturally and in terms of scientific and technological innovation. I love the New York Fair site for multiple reasons. One, it's the easiest for me to get to. So on a practical level, I've been able to photograph there probably about 20 or 25 times at this point. And it's also a great example of kind of these huge sculptural pavilions that are really unwieldy and expensive to maintain and preserve. And that's one of the complications of all of these fair sites. These things are built to impress and kind of prove national might in a competitive but positive nature at the fairs. But often there wasn't a whole lot of planning as to what to do afterward. And New York has been a great example of that, and it just keeps transforming and transforming, which means I just keep photographing it. This is the Unisphere, which is immense. I mean, you can kind of see those little blurry people. Those are skateboarders, so that gives you an idea of the scale. And much of this fair site had fallen into disrepair. And then in 2009, I believe it was, they renovated the Unisphere really beautifully. The fountains are working again. It's quite an impressive thing to behold when you're out in Flushing Meadows. And then, you know, some of the sculptural remnants that are left are quite fun as well. This was a Polish sculptor named Theodore Roszak, and this was a sculpture called Forms in Transit. So it's supposed to be this kind of futuristic, exciting jet plane, but it's kind of turning blackish. It's partially hidden by this unwieldy shrubbery underneath it. It's these little details that I find quite fun when I'm photographing. And this was the heliport for 1964, where the well-heeled could arrive in their private helicopters. Now it's more often for use for things like proms and bar mitzvahs and other such events. And those of you who are New York based probably recognize this building because it's the most prominent of everything out there. This was designed by Philip Johnson for 1964 World's Fair, the New York State Pavilion. And it's certainly unusual as far as a Philip Johnson design. It's, you know, kind of carousel-like, if anything, circus-like, if anything. And it's large and oval and has these observation decks. and again, very complicated to maintain and keep structurally sound. So after the fair closed, there were some attempts to keep this in a functional condition. It was used for arena rock concerts, it was used as a roller skating rink. But then ultimately, in the 70s, as much of the city was kind of going into decline economically, so did the New York State Pavilion. When I first started this project in 2007, this was the condition of the pavilion. It was covered in ivy, it was rusting and leaning, and not in great shape. I returned in 2013, and some volunteers who have been really amazing in bringing attention to this structure had just repainted the red and white stripes. So I photographed in the middle of winter with this kind of this sundown light illuminating the unusual aspects of this building. And then 2017, it had been completely repainted. A lot of repairs had been done. And when I traveled there for this particular shoot, I was just so amazed by the energy this building was given off. And since then, the Queensborough president has raised funds to make this structurally sound, and there's been some pretty exciting design competitions to figure out how this building can be productively used and part of the Flushing Meadow cityscape in the future. So then we move on to 1967 in Montreal. This is Buckminster Fuller's Geodesic Dome, and the title of this is Buckminster Fuller's Geodesic Dome with a Solar Experimental House. So in 2012, I traveled to Montreal to photograph this, and it was by pure luck that this little bungalow with solar panels and a green facade was constructed in front of the geodesic dome. This is not a permanent structure. It just happened to be there as a winning design for an architectural student competition. And I really appreciated how this little house was literally in the shadow of Buckminster Fuller's dome, as of course, Fuller is arguably the main thinker and creator of these ideas of sustainability, which have so infused design since then. Also on the Montreal site is this enormous Calder sculpture. Again, you can see some little people down there to kind of give you an idea of the scale of this thing. And it's situated on the edge of the St. Lawrence River in Parc Jean Drapeau. And you kind of have to meander through these trails to even see this immense sculpture. And there was some talk of trying to move it to the main part of Montreal, but it's too big to move. So instead, you have to kind of search for it if you want to experience this incredible piece of art, or go to the Summer Electronic Music Arts Festival, which is held underneath it. And this is this blue robot kind of just left in a roundabout, also in Montreal from 1967. It looked so sad there, you know, just kind of neglected, people just driving around, not really noticing. So another great example of some of the more humorous remnants from these events. Also in Montreal was Moises Softy's incredible Habitat 67 design. Still very futuristic, still influencing much in urban design and residences. He was only 21 when this was constructed. It was very last minute and wasn't even finished in time for the fair. But today, it's, I would say, the only World's Fair structure that is residential and a historic landmark. So I photographed it during the day. And something I love about this building is, you know, every city has its own approach to historic preservation. And here, people have been allowed to kind of modify their little cubes as they want to. So we have these very strange elements like this glass on the left of this kind of screen enclosed balcony, the little pink tent-like structure. I mean, there's just these great details all over. And then I photographed it at night just to see how it became more animated at night. Then just a year later, San Antonio hosted a World's Fair. And again, monorails. These are actually the leftover monorail tracks from the 1968 fair. Instead of demolishing them, they decided to turn them into a fountain. So it was this lovely fountain when I traveled there to photograph about 5 years ago. San Antonio is a complicated site. And literally, when I got there to photograph, they were demolishing World's Fair buildings in front of me. So I don't know how much is left at this point. I don't know what's happened there, but I know it's been a kind of a fraught discussion as to how to best use what's left. And one of the few still usable structures from 1968, the Instituto Cultural de Mexico. And this I thought was just so funny. It was this closed down ticket booth left over. And it kind of reminded me of those little Kodak photomats. So I thought it was a fun little building to photograph. The smallest American city to host a fair was Spokane in 1974. This was the USA Pavilion, and now it is a toddler amusement park. Spokane is also the site of the first IMAX movie theater, so a pretty terrible structure, but there it is. And then 1982, the Sun Sphere in Knoxville. A lot of folks are familiar with this structure because it was featured in The Simpsons. And, you know, there certainly was this focus on towers and spheres, kind of starting with the 1960 fairs specifically. In 1984, New Orleans hosted a fair, and again, the Bureau of International Exposition said, America just hosted a fair in 1982. There's no reason to host another one there, but New Orleans forged ahead anyway. It was very poorly planned and actually went bankrupt during the fair actually happening. And not much is left except for King Triton, right here, and this convention center, this beige convention center beyond. So kind of a sad tale. And the most recent site that I photographed other than 1992 in Seville was the 1986 Vancouver World's Fair, which had a focus on transportation and renewable sources of energy. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this barge, but this is one of the few things left over from the fair. There are a few buildings in the middle of the city as well. This is actually a futuristic floating McDonald's. And it took quite a bit of searching to find this floating out in the bay. It was originally right in the middle of Vancouver. And after the fair closed, just like the more stable buildings, there's kind of this shrug, like, what do we do with this futuristic floating McDonald's? Eventually, a gentleman decided he would turn it into a nightclub. So he purchased it from the city, but he didn't get the appropriate variances necessary to turn it into a nightclub. So it ended up just kind of sitting there in the middle of the city and turning into this major eyesore. So eventually the government said, you know what, you've got to get this thing out of here. So now it's in this kind of industrial stretch, about 40 minutes outside of the city. This I photographed in 2013, or 14 rather. So I'm not sure if it's still floating out there, but this was the condition it was in when I went there to photograph. So the futuristic floating McDonald's of the 1986 Expo. So just to finish up, this is an ongoing project. Feel free to stay in touch for news of exhibitions and talks. I have a book of the project, which I can show to you all shortly. And this work is often exhibited. So there was supposed to be a group exhibition open now at the London Art Museum in Canada, but of course, because of COVID, it's been pushed to September. So the working title for that exhibition is We Are All Astronauts, and it's an exhibition specifically looking at Buckminster Fuller's influence upon London, Ontario. Prints are available through Front Room Gallery in New York and Tracy Morgan Gallery in Asheville, North Carolina. And if you want to see more of these pictures or get in touch, there is my website.
All right, thank you, Jade.
Sure.
Awesome. We do have a couple of questions and comments that came through during the presentation, and also if questions are still out there, please put them in the chat. We definitely had a bunch of reminiscence from a couple of the World's Fairs, including, of course, our hometown World's Fair from '64, which a lot of people have a lot of good memories of. Two plugs I will say before we get into questions. You mentioned the volunteers who redid or who are painting the New York State Pavilion. We did a talk with them. If you missed it, you should watch it. These guys are awesome. Mitch and Stephanie are just the coolest. And Aaron is part of People for the Pavilion, so you can learn more about the restoration of that. So Ralph Lewis asked back in the Spain, one of your first pictures, he asked if that was a rocket in the background. And it looked like it.
Yes, it is a rocket next to an overgrown canal.
Okay. Much like what we have out in Queens, we've got a couple, I think we have a Mercury rocket over by the Hall of Science too. If you haven't seen that, you can see it from the 7 trade. It's really cool. Peter Tannen said there's a plaque in the middle of a Buffalo residential street marking the spot of the fair site where President McKinley was assassinated.
Yes.
And then the house, which I've actually been to, where he died, is run by the National Park Service now. It's actually a really good place to visit as well.
And I should also add, fairs were where a lot of first inventions were debuted, and X-rays had just been invented. So McKinley's initial X-ray was one of the first ever. Unfortunately, he died anyway, but that was how they saw the bullet.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's so cool. Atticus asks, didn't they use the Pan American Fair buildings for Xanadu?
I actually don't know. It's a good question.
Okay. Atticus, we will get on that and get back to you. Or Atticus, if you have more information, let us know. Peter Tannen again says, Treasure Island was supposed to be the new San Francisco airport before the Navy took over. That's why one of the surviving buildings you showed looks like a 1930s airport terminal. And the Brussels Atomium was restored, and he visited it in the late 60s. Mark Weber says the Seattle monorail runs from downtown to the old World's Fair site.
Thank you. Couldn't remember.
And let's see, some memories of the World's Fair. I believe the World's, I lost track a little bit. Oh yeah, Modern Ruin. Modern Ruin is a really great documentary about the New York State Pavilion. I've met Matthew Silva. It's really, really cool. Atticus asks if there's been a World's Fair since 1992. I was actually going to ask you, I noticed Portugal is missing. Is that because you haven't been there, or it was a World Expo? So I'm not sure if you're making the demarcation or not.
Oh, that's a great question. So expos and fairs are one and the same. Right. I guess they decided exposition was to 19th century, so the use of the word expo started to be used more prevalently, I guess starting in the 30s to 60s. And this is an ongoing project. As of right now, I photographed all of the sites in North America. And right now I'm kind of working out plans to photograph the continents, which I'm missing. I'm missing all of Asia, I'm missing Australia, and I haven't been able to travel to all of the European sites yet. So I am working through a large list. Making this much work took about 10 years. So, don't hold your breath, but it will happen.
It is. It's one of the few I've actually been to. I've been to Paris, I've been to Montreal, and I went to Lisbon last year. And the monument to the navigators and the sailors out there, which I think was part of the 40 exposition, it's one of the most breathtaking monuments I've ever seen. It stops you dead in your tracks, and it aligns with the sun. There's a giant sword that aligns with the sun and hits points on the globe that Portugal had been to. It's absolutely crazy. With more questions coming in.
I should also add there was supposed to be an expo this year in Dubai, and because of the coronavirus has been pushed to 2021.
Right. And the Olympics as well. From Jack asks, have you uncovered in your studies what former World Fair ideas have been featured most prominently in later urban planning?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Frederick Law Olmsted really shaped much of the urban design elements in the late 20th century fairs, and I would say that has influenced all of urban planning on park sites more than anything.
Yeah, and Buffalo is a really interesting example of that. When you go up to, people have a lot of conceived notions of what Buffalo is as a city. especially now in the modern context. And I think you realize how much that World's Fair influenced the city,
Mhm.
and Olmsted himself.
Yeah.
Um,
And I also say, just, on a practical level, um, again, many of these cities would use these events. So it was a competition to host a World's Fair. And then there would be a lot of money raised to bring about a lot of civic improvements for the cities that would host them. So it was a real, positive reason for a city to host one. They would be able to develop infrastructure and hospitality and a lot of permanent aspects to the city. So I would say all of the fairs have really benefited from massive improvements in transportation and other aspects.
yeah. Are there any plans for upcoming fairs in the US or elsewhere? I'm not sure. Do you know?
Well, I see a colleague of mine, Jennifer Minner. I think she knows the dates better than me.
There you go.
So feel free to ask her.
So Jennifer, if you have any information about that, please share it in the chat. Jennifer is also asking that we participate in funding you to go to Australia, Japan, China, and the Emirates. Is there any way, do you have a GoFundMe or a Patreon, or is there anything that you are doing to fund your work and your trips out there? Is it all supported by sales of your stuff? How does that work for you?
Well, let's see, for the last 10 years of work, it was kind of hodgepodge. I did run 2 Kickstarter campaigns, which were successful. I have galleries and dealers that were helping me along by making sales here and there. So yeah, a little bit piecemeal at the moment. And right now I am working with somebody on some proposals to try to photograph some of the remaining sites, especially in Asia and Australia, and hopefully get to Dubai to photograph the construction and deconstruction of that site.
Great. Yeah, and if anybody's interested, I posted your website onto the chat. I know it's also on that card, which you can throw back up at some time before everybody gets off the call. Peter Tannen brought up, in the age of ubiquitous Zoom sessions, I'm reminded of the new picture phone I saw at the 1964 World's Fair. My mom saw her first TV at the 39.
Yeah.
It is amazing how much, like you said, World's Fairs, especially the ones in the mid-century, are very polarizing, but so much of our lives are influenced by things that were debuted at some of these fairs.
Yes, anything from, one of my favorite examples is the first World's Fair in 1851 in London debuted photography.
Right.
So, that's where, for example, Roger Fenton first saw photography and became one of Europe's greatest 19th century photographers. So, some major inspiration and innovation was presented at these things.
Yeah. Also, I believe the elevator debuted at the first New York World's Fair.
Otis Elevator, yes.
Yeah, Otis's elevator, right, in the Crystal Palace, which is one of those buildings in New York I would have died to go back in time to see.
I know. Yeah.
We had another great building, although not a World's Fair, Expo Fair Park site of the State Fair of Texas in Dallas, is an amazing collection of deco buildings.
From the 30s, yes.
So Jennifer says, I think the US started paying BIE dues again under Trump, but need to fact check. I'm worried about what a World's Fair would look like in the US. We do not need to make a US great again fair. It would be interesting to see what city and what we would bring to the table now. I'm very interested to see what Dubai is going to bring to the table.
Yeah, I visited, the only live fair I've been to was Milan in 2015. And that fair was really fraught with tension. First, they spent millions of dollars to bring in infrastructure to build the fair site and kind of bungled the job. So they need to spend more money and redesign the fair site. There were protests because there were some unemployment issues in Italy at the time. And there was a real question of, well, why is this even necessary? Why is this relevant? So they've certainly been fraught in recent years. Why this expense in this day and age?
Yeah, no, that's very true. Also, what came up multiple times, I'd say 2 or 3 during the presentation and during the chat, is the Disney World, and obviously the Disneyfication of America, in the fact that Disney was heavily influenced by the 64 World's Fair. He was a big participant in it. And so America seemed to get after that its own almost permanent like World's Fair, which is what he was trying to do out in Epcot. in Florida. So it's interesting, that evolution that came from 64 to Disney World in the 70s and Disneyland in between the 39 and 64 World's Fair. So
Yeah, and I should also add, America had a horrible showing in 2015 Milan. Russia had this, immense, very impressive red pavilion that people were flocking to. China had several and really incredibly designed pavilion buildings. So did the UK. And America's it literally looked like they spent like $20 on the architecture and design. It was just so terribly designed and kind of generic and didn't really speak anything about what our design goals or ambition is as a nation.
right, yeah. Yeah, Philip says Epcot at Disney World is the best existing and living replica of a World's Fair experience. God, I haven't been in 20-ish years to Epcot, so I hope I know they did a lot to update it, because even when I went in the 90s, it was getting a little dated. But I think they've done a lot of work to it. And Jennifer did put up a link to the BIE website and talking about us paying dues again. And again, we're getting a lot of people. This has been a great chat. This is one of our best Zoom chats yet. So Jade, you've inspired really good conversation. I heartily invite all of you to take a look at the chat. Also, if anybody is ever interested in the chat transcript, when the meetings are done, we get copies, text files of the transcripts. I'm happy to send them to you if you want to email me at justin@untappedcities.com. Anybody on the talk, especially this one, there's a lot of good links and a lot of really good information here.
I actually just wanted to add, Philip Shane is here at the talk, and he's been working on a documentary about the Lost Utopia series for the last few years. So he's traveled with me to several sites and has gotten some really awesome footage. So keep an eye out for that also. And then the monograph of the work from 2007 through 2016 is in this book, which you can contact me at my studio to acquire rather than supporting large corporations.
Yeah, great. Also, Philip, if you have a link to any of that work, please put it in the chat as well. And Peter suggested, just for all of you, you can also highlight and copy the chats as well. Thank you, Peter. That's a good idea. I actually never thought of that. Is there any other questions for Jade before we wrap up today's? This has been amazing. And I know we've got a lot of World's Fair fans here who I know appreciated it quite a bit. We wish you luck in doing your further work and getting to some of those sites. Any other questions for Jade? So if anything else, I am going to let all the insiders know what's coming up. We have a very robust week. Oh, Philip Shane did put a documentary sneak peek in the chat, so through Vimeo. So please copy that link. I'll leave it up for a bit. And again, I am happy to send you a text file of the chat if you email me. So I am speaking tomorrow on what we are calling the Maritime History of New York, but I'm changing the name to the Remnants of the Port of New York, which we'll talk about tomorrow if you join me. We're going to be doing a great little survey of some of the very important maritime history and what we can see today from it. John DeSanto, who did our Secrets of Stuyvesant Town talk, on Thursday will be doing, this is a really great talk. His work for 10 years as captain of a serving team at Windows on the World. He opened Windows on the World. He's got great pictures, menus, memorabilia. It's really interesting, and John is the perfect person to tell the story. And then on Friday, all at noon, by the way, Jillian is doing her Secrets of the High Line tour virtually. It's a virtual tour talk. So more stuff. Yes, Michael Caine. If it's a Justin tour, it's going to say Remnants. That's true. I'm the Remnant guy. It's going to be fun. Thank you, Jade. Anything you want to say, Jade, before you sign off? And again, please feel free to put your last card with the information up as you do it.
Oh, yeah, let me do that. Well, I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, so much for attending. Oops, sorry, let me find that. There we go. And, just stay tuned. I'm always working on this project. I have several colleagues that are engaged in this content as well. And this topic it continues to be timely. The last expos have been in countries that are now among the most powerful, such as China, or countries that are trying to show that they are a contemporary force to be reckoned with, such as Kazakhstan. So, I mean, where these expos take place right now is so fascinating, and the history is so meaty. So, definitely, I encourage you all to dive in a bit more.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Awesome, awesome. And Jade, we'll have you back when we'll do more. We'll do a next installment.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you, insiders, very much for joining us. Thank you, guests of Jade, for joining us. It's always good to see you, and hopefully we will see you guys again tomorrow. Have a good day, guys. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.